Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 341 of Humanity Rising on this 18th day of October. Over the 18 months that we've been going, we've been covering a multiplicity of issues all around how we navigate through a world that is now being gripped not only by COVID, but social and political turbulence, climate escalation, and a world in which planning is increasingly problematic. I think most of us look back to the days before COVID as with some kind of nostalgia, where we could go as we pleased, we could basically live as we pleased, and all of a sudden we're in lockdown, we're engaging in social distancing, we're dealing with a virus that just simply won't go away. We have social media full of fake news. We have all kinds of challenges. And in and through this, individuals, families, communities, governments somehow have to articulate strategy. How do you create strategy in a sea of chaos? That's the real challenge of our world today. And with a future that looks inexorably as if it's going to be structured and framed by escalating chaos. That's what it means to be in code red for humanity, given the fact that we are now in the climate tipping point. So we brought together today some people who thought very deeply about the issue of strategic thinking under current world conditions, because strategy in 2021 is very different than strategy in 2017, 2018, 2019, pre-COVID. So that's our subject today. I want to welcome you. Let us pause before we dive in, as we always do, to just take a moment in the midst of all the tumult, to just pause, take a deep breath, close our eyes, and place our attention on our hearts. Just for a minute, let us attune ourselves to our heartbeats in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving that we're alive at this most extraordinary moment in the human journey, where every category of being has been thrown up into the air, and we have the privilege of redefining who we are as we face the future. Thank you, everyone. It's always so good to just take a moment and feel all of you. It opens my heart and it fills me with deep gratitude and love for each and every one of you joining our session today. I want to now turn to our program on strategy, and I want to introduce a colleague, Jonathan Sappi, who is a consultant, an independent consultant in strategy and creativity and leadership. He advises mostly mid-sized companies in the United States, Europe, and around the world. And he's thought a lot about strategy. He was trained at Harvard and Yale, so he comes from good pedigree in these matters. And he's very generously offered to bring in a couple of deep thinkers on the matter of strategy that he'll introduce in a moment. But Jonathan, I just want to thank you for joining Humanity Rising and welcome you, and turn the program now over to your capable hands.
Jim, thank you. Thank you so much. It's an amazing thing you've done over the last year and more than a half now, putting this together. I've enjoyed so many of the sessions, and it's a privilege to be able to share some thoughts today. So I just wanted to appreciate the program and thank you for welcoming us. Yeah, I feel very strongly that we need to think hard about strategy. We have not only specific public health challenges and climate challenges and social challenges that need strategies, but all of our institutions need to be rethinking strategy in the context of those challenges. And so in theory, right now, there should be a lot of strategizing going on. And that's, for organizations ranging from the World Health Organization to Walmart to digital startups and legacy institutions in the world, sort of rethinking what is possible for them in what are fundamentally different circumstances. The premise for this session is built on a book that was published in 2013. The title of the book is Strategy, AHistory by Sir Lawrence Freedman. And it's a wonderful book. It's not short. I'll post a link in the chat shortly so that you can find out more about it. But it is a rich journey through history of mankind, really, thinking about strategy. And he divides the book into three parts. There's a section on military history, a section on political history, and a section on business history. But it's a wonderful understanding of the legacy of what strategists do and what they focus on, that winds from Sun Tzu to Winston Churchill and Jack Welch and all the way up to the early 2010s, and then he closes the book. And I was thinking recently that it's time to start thinking about what the next chapter in the history of strategy is, given the magnitude of the changes that have occurred over the last 2 years. And so we're going to have some fun with that today. I am going to introduce two colleagues who are going to be able to lend tremendous perspective to this. Joseph Jaworski has devoted much of his life to exploring the deeper dimensions of transformational leadership. He is the founder and chairman of Generon International, where he advises CEOs and senior executives in Fortune 500 companies. He specializes in the design and execution of large-scale organizational change, as well as strategy formation and implementation. He is a pioneer and prominent thought leader in the discipline of strategic foresight, enabling leaders to deepen their capacity for tactical and strategic insight. Joseph, thank you so much for joining us today. Also with us is Kat Tully, the founder of the School of International Futures based in the UK. Prior to setting up the School of International Futures, Kat was Strategy Project Director at the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office and Senior Policy Advisor in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Before working in government, she worked in strategy and international relations across the not-for-profit and business sectors, including Christian Aid, TechnoServe, and Procter & Gamble. Kat has also worked for the UN, the EU Commission, and the World Bank. Her degrees are from Cambridge and Princeton universities. She's a trustee of the Foundation for Democracy and Sustainable Development, a member of the UN Learning Advisory Council for the 2030 Agenda, and a global board member of Academics Stand Against Poverty. Kat, thank you as well for joining us this morning. There you are. Everyone's here. So I've explained the explicit premise for the session this morning. An implicit suggestion is that given the magnitude of the challenges we face in the world today, maybe we could have been practicing strategy more effectively in the collective. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that this morning. And you two in particular are wonderful to have in terms of looking forward and thinking of what might be different and what strategists might be doing and thinking and practicing differently. So we'll get around to that, but let's step all the way back and even pause for a second. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about sort of a deceptively simple question, and that what good is strategy? What do we get from it? Why do you focus your energy and attention there? And what sort of return on investment do you think might be available to those who engage in the practice and are rethinking things at this time? Kat, I'm going to ask you to go first.
Brilliant. Thank you. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. And it's so lovely to be here. Thanks, Jonathan, for the invitation to join you and this community of such inspiring people. Yes, well, what is it and why is it important? This strategy word, I mean, both you and Jim used the word the journey, right? And it feels as if strategy has been on a journey over the past millennia, not least, but at the heart of it, I don't think there's been much that has changed really in some of its practice in terms of it's about the reflection on the direction and purpose of your mission and the importance of creating the space to actually, instead of just looking inward and looking backwards historically, to actually do the endeavor of collectively with your within your organization, but also within the people in the community that you're in, to actually look forward, to look at your changing landscape and look at it from different viewpoints, I think is really important. And then having done that, really kind of understand, given the resources that you have, what are the best choices and selections for action. So far, so the same, right? That feels perhaps the study of strategy or the depiction of strategy in books, especially under kind of capitalist system over the past 200 years has defined it as something that's much more top down, led by often men of a certain color, of a certain position in society. But actually, I think that where we're getting to, which is that because of the uncertainty and the disruption around us, and by the way, also questionable whether the disruption is happening at a faster pace or whether it's just that the anthropomorphic levels of risk that we face are so great. But now it feels as if we can't do strategy without two critical things. One is with a structured way of understanding complexity and alternative futures. And second, in a way that involves the co-creation and involvement of the community that are affected within that. And so what that means is that we have to talk about the future in the plural, as Jim Data always says. it is our futures. They are both going to happen to us and inevitable in some ways, despite the fact that we don't always manage to engage with some of those futures. Even though, for example, limits to growth very nicely depicted the kind of challenges that we were going to hit in the 2020s as the ecological, the demographic, and the geopolitical tensions all came together to create a very turbulent world indeed. So we both have to become better at engaging with those slow, long-term trends that, as Graham Molitor says, kind of play out over 50, 60 years, but also need to become much better at understanding the social, political, and economic impacts, third-order consequences of technological disruption. And that has to be done in community. It can't be done by the people at the center, really, because the periphery is much better at understanding how that horizon emerges. So I think in those two ways, co-creation and engaging with alternative futures have always been at the heart of strategic endeavors from Thucydides all the way onwards. However, I think the framing and methodology and the tools and the approaches that we can now use to understand how we do that, and it is a science and it's an art together as a craft, because of the fact that it's about building a community, bringing people together to transform. That's what I think we're beginning to learn much more about how to do that as a craft effectively in 2021.
Joseph, I'm going to ask you the same question. What do we get out of what is strategy, and why should we be worried about it at all?
Well, thank you, Jonathan. So like Kat, it's a privilege to be here with you all. I'm excited to share with you and I see this as a mutual learning opportunity. Well, let me begin by telling you that a little story. I was in a meeting at the Organizational Learning Center at MIT back in 1995, and I was meeting with Peter Senge and Michael Porter, who is one of the best strategists on the face of the planet. And Michael said something interesting and surprising to me. He leaned over the table, looking directly at me, and said, the dirty little secret is that nobody knows how to do strategy. And I found that to be remarkable. And the more I thought about it, and the more I worked in social and government and business circles, the more I realized he was correct. So the fact is, underscoring what Kat said, is that there's very little innovation that has occurred in the field of strategy formation and implementation in the last 100 years. And the typical way strategy has been formed is by the people at the top, and they create a binder, put it on the shelf, and it's a 5-year plan, and it's never changed. So we need new tools and new processes and a whole new view of how to create and implement strategy. If given the opportunity later in the program, I'll mention a couple. Just for example, the generative scenario planning, which is very different from traditional scenario planning, and another tool and process is one I call enactment, which we can talk about. But again, just underscoring what Kat said, the strategy formation and implementation both have to be more exclusive and have to be done in community.
Joseph, stay on with me. I'm gonna transition to the next question, and we will get a chance to talk about those. But I guess it's remarkable to me, and I often, at least legend has it, that the Economist once said that nobody really knows what strategy is. And I've requested confirmation from the editors. I haven't heard back from them yet, but in any case, it's a provocative statement along the lines of the one that you heard. But why do you think that it's so difficult? Why is strategy elusive? Why do the binders get published and then put on a shelf and not changed? Why is this so hard?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure I know the complete answer, John, but to me, the principal reason is institutional conformity. Institutional conformity. I believe this is a real disease in business, in NGOs, and in government. There's more of a fixed mindset by the leaders, the people at the top, and that's as opposed to a growth mindset, and one that is willing to embrace a whole new way of thinking about things, including strategy, and this creates blind spots, and these people at the top are mainly embracing the old way of management, which is command and control, and the strategy is formed with the leadership team at the top, and it's very short-sighted and usually very disconnected. And the hallmark of great strategy formation is, in my opinion, a clear view of current reality. If you don't understand current reality, you can't begin to sense what's needed for the future. So those are my initial thoughts, John.
Kat?
And Joe's absolutely spot on. There's something about institutionalization and the fact that true transformation requires disruption and movement away from an incumbency that, quite frankly, basically means that the people at the center, Horizon 1, should be the last people to lead a strategy process if the business environment is that uncertain, right? And there's never, there's lots of different quotes, like from Thomas Watson in 1946, saying that there would only be the market for 3 computers that kind of support that, right? But let me just perhaps kind of give a bit more granularity and say, I think that strategy is often partially applied and it's also partially implemented. And what do I mean by that is that strategy especially in a turbulent environment, has the ability to both enable you to come together to agree and envision together your desired future, your desired outcome as a business, as a community, as a nation, but also enables you to kind of look at the alternatives that might occur and prepare and head some of them off. So it's that dual nature that's really powerful and necessary, I think, to effective delivery of strategy in the 21st century. But the private sector as a whole tends to be environment takers, so they use it much more for the kind of risk side. And in my experience, governments tend to kind of assume that they are environment shapers, that they're the ones that can say what the future looks like. And so they do far too much insufficient alternative scenario planning with the exception of the military occasionally. And similarly, there's interesting differences between developing country nations and developed country nations, where you've got in developing countries, a lot of strategy is about how to become like Singapore, how to go up the value chain. So it is absolutely about, effectively your economic growth strategy. Whereas in developed countries, industrialized nations, the community that has ended up holding strategy and long-term thinking in the civil service space, in the policy space that I mostly operate in nowadays, is actually the intelligence, foreign policy and national security space. So you have these very different kind of communities that have different vocabularies and different ways of looking at the world, and it doesn't help achieve a holistic view where actually at the national level, but also in our cities, our health and our well-being and our education and our connection to the outside world and what's happening in logistics chain from China to here are all tightly interwoven. So we need that holistic approach, and yet the practice of strategy and the vocabulary of strategy and the tools are so deeply siloed. And I think that's something that we really try to kind of bring together. The other thing that I do, it also seems that strategy is hard to do well because there's two steps, right? There's developing the strategy or detecting the signal from the noise. And then there's something around acting on it. The Kodak example is a classic one versus Konica Minolta. And there, I think we've got, and that actually is where most strategies fail to get acted on. So it's not the fact that we haven't seen the change happening over the 2020s or the lack of nursing staff in the National Health Service in the UK, or the growing aridity of West African in northern Nigeria, where we're doing some really interesting work on energy. That is evident. The question is, how do you actually marshal people together to change and engage? And that's not about necessarily the quality of supply of insight. It's actually about the demand side and setting up kind of institutions that can actually engage. And I think there we're seeing a huge interest and appetite from the UN's Secretary General's Our Common Agenda that came out 3 weeks ago. He's absolutely saying we have to think about what are the processes, our culture as organizations and the institutions and the people that we bring into it that enable us to think of what does this mean for future generations? And that's a really amazing challenge that he's set us, that I think strategy is critical to help us achieve if we do it well.
So convening that dialogue, right, is just such a challenge, right? And designing it in a way that draws from multiple perspectives and establishes common language. Such a critical aspect of doing it and doing it well, as you say. I have this image that I like to use. I call it strategy as a practice. And it's my belief that, strategic consideration and deliberation and decision-making can be much more persistent and responsive and creative. But it needs to be designed, right? It needs to be really carefully crafted and managed. In addition to that creative challenge, I think it would be helpful if we stopped and thought a little bit about what we might need to stop doing. What are some of the aspects of strategy over the course of the last 100 years that have been less helpful in terms of creating positive change, and they just don't help us anymore. I mean, I was laughing to myself the other day about the old days when Coke versus Pepsi was an interesting market challenge and seems so quaint today. I think more broadly, the idea of a one-on-one competition for a fixed pie just doesn't seem to resonate or be as helpful. So, Joseph, in addition to all of your work in terms of helping people start to think differently, what are you hoping that they will unlearn from a strategist's perspective?
Well, so I think what you've said is really important, John. In essence, they've got to let go of old thinking. They've got to let go of old thinking and the old way of doing strategy when things were less volatile and less uncertain and ambiguous. So, for example, we can talk about this later, but I've been involved as leading a scenario team at Royal Dutch Shell for a number of years. And without getting into the detail, my strong feeling as I came into the system was that I can explain more later, but we had to let go of the old way of doing scenario planning, which was reacting quicker than the competition to what was emerging in the world. Reacting quicker and beating the competition by 6 months or a year or two was a real winning strategy, and that's no longer useful. What we need to do a new way, which we can talk about. Really, at the essence of this is having an organization, whether it's a governmental organization or business or an NGO, led by transformational leadership instead of transactional leadership. These people have to be what I've referred and written about as stage 3 and stage 4 people who have open mindsets and are lifelong learners and people who are willing to cede control of everything they're doing to the whole community and the whole system involved. So, for example, the old learning cycle that we all learned in business school is called the Kolb learning cycle, the Dewey learning cycle sometimes, and that's learning from the past, where the organization would do something, they would look back at it and say, this is what we did, this is what the results were, and you learn from what you did, and then you modify it and do it again in sort of a slightly different way. And that's learning from the past, but that's not going to work anymore in this environment. You have to create a new learning cycle, which is one where you learn from the future, sense into the future, exercise foresight, and that's going to win the day.
Kat, what do we need to let go of?
Yeah, well, I'm actually a big fan of Henry Mintzberg, who already in 1987 was in that very famous Canadian Journal of something, Public Affairs or whatever, has an amazing description of what emergent strategy is all about. And there he says what you should stop doing, which is, it's stop doing top down, stop having fear, open up, and understand the power, stop being power blind, understand the power dynamics in the room, and stop being linear and stop seeking, answers and definite answers, and be comfortable with change. Now, my instinct is that many people intuitively do think across silos. They we all have families and we live in communities, and we see that the world is interdependent, and we actually know how important words like love and peace and passion and humility are. It's just that we seem to kind of leave all that behind when we go into the office. I think there's something about the fact that the ecosystem and the incentives in our organizations, and then the sectors, whether they're food security, urban food systems, human rights sector, women's rights sector, they tend to kind of just, keep us in the here and the now, and there's incentives to basically do what you did before. So I'm a real believer in actually, and we've done some really interesting work comparing different governments, like 9 different governments that are slightly more able to be strategic, and why, explore why. Sometimes it's because, nothing like having a 2,000-mile border with Russia to make you look into the future, or be in the middle of the Malacca Straits and 70% of your income be dependent on that. That makes you be strategic and think about, 20 years ago, having a seat on the Arctic Council, even though it couldn't literally be further away from you in the world. But that's kind of, those are some of the issues to kind of understand, let's look at countries who sometimes are a little bit more future prepared and focused than others, and why did that happen? And also let's look at businesses and civil society organizations. And I know DSM is an amazing organization in the Netherlands, who has really done the amazing thing, which is, and I think that this is back to the kind of practice. And if there's one thing that the one thing that's really difficult is, getting leaders to break things before they're broken, to change things before they're broken, right? That's the thing. It's the herd instinct, right? It's like changing and move it. That's why the CEO of DSM, Sebastian, was so amazing. He moved away from very high lucrative plastics to kind of nutrition and food, and did that. And you saw what happened with Paul Pullman. He actually got spanked a little bit on the stock market occasionally. Still absolutely did the right thing. So it is important to kind of see this not just as responsibilizing the individuals, but actually ensuring that we have the institutions and the systems that enable our hopefully much more communal behavior to emerge.
We are going to come back to the idea of transformation and transformational leadership, because I think it's so critical, and both of you have already sort of hit on that essence of changing the nature of who you are and how you present to your world. But I want to linger a little bit on what I call a powerful yet problematic aspect of strategy, because in essence, in developing strategies, we're essentially suggesting, number one, that we can predict the future, and number two, that we can control the events to our advantage in a future state. And in this context, storytelling becomes an important and powerful tool. I just think that it's so fascinating because we live in the age that we do. We live in the age of disinformation and misinformation and alternative facts. And storytellers, as strategists, you would think would be truth tellers, or some relationship between the stories that they're telling about the strategies they want to execute on and what's actually going to happen in the world. And yet, in the startup world, we have a wink, wink, nod, nod phrase that people always say, which is, fake it until you make it. And then you run into stories like the Theranos story, or the Aussie media story just in recent weeks, where people are just misrepresenting not only what they are, but who they are in certain cases. And there's certainly no shortage of, stories around storytelling in the past that end up to be intentionally fictional, right? Enron, 2009 financial crisis among those. So I was wondering if you two can offer any wisdom in terms of how to balance that dynamic of envisioning the future and creating institutional momentum on the one hand, and on the other hand, deceiving people or misleading them and manipulating them. Joseph, I'm going to start with you this time.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, John. You know, you just reminded me of, by mentioning the Enron story, how profoundly dysfunctional that whole operation was. It's a true scandal. And it's a study in how a system can corrupt itself. Kenneth Lay was the chairman and the first CEO, and I personally knew him. He was, I thought, an upstanding individual, but the whole system ended up corrupting itself, and they were informing the investment community about holdings that didn't exist. They were just fake, and they had off-book accounting. It was just stunning, and the whole thing disappeared. Just collapsed overnight, and took a lot of lives and good people with them, including institutions like their CPAs. So the storytelling that I think is useful and that is actually quite remarkable if it's done right is the storytelling of using scenarios. Those were first developed by the military, and then in the late 60s were adopted by a Royal Dutch Shell group of companies, and the legendary Pierre Vogt was the first group scenario planner, and they created a set of scenarios that told the story of the oil price collapse in the late 60s, which in effect was a story of exactly what happened. And Shell created these scenarios and then went around to they had something like 130 operating companies. They went around to just about all of them, 90 or 100 of them, and told these stories to the leadership teams and many of the diagonal slice of workers, and helped them live in these scenarios. They told the scenarios and they created workshops where they lived in these scenarios. And so when that new future emerged, which was unheard of and unthinkable to most people and most organizations, they were able to react over a year earlier than all the rest of the oil companies. And at the time that this occurred, they were sort of number 7 of the so-called 7 sisters. And within a year, they were number 1 in terms of revenue and all the metrics. So that's the kind of storytelling that is useful. But we can talk about this later, but I'm not sure, I don't believe that that's adequate today, that sort of scenario planning that is helping the organization to react more quickly to emerging futures. I think what's needed today in the kind of business environment you and Kat and Jim have been describing is what I call normative scenario planning, where you actually create a set of stories and you use them to shape the future, not react to it, but to shape it and to live into that future using all the companies or the organization's resources to help shift and create that future. I actually began to, I proposed this back in 1995, and it took a long time for the organization to begin to adopt it. But in 19, I think it was around 2000, that in a scenario that they published called Blueprints, which was about climate change. They adopted this view of scenario planning and have been doing it ever since.
Kat?
So storytelling and narratives especially bring the interdependent features of scenarios to life, right? So it's a critical part of our work, helping connect to people and get them to imagine alternative futures. So it's a really important means to an end, if you like, in our work. And they're incredibly powerful, harnessing metaphors, right? We were working with someone, Lord Whakathanua from Tonga, and it's like, if you're talking about the story of a small island developing state, that is very different to telling the story of a large ocean state, which is what Tonga actually is. If you put all the tiny little dots of the archipelagos and the 200 miles of sea around it that the law of the sea gives them as a state, it's a huge part of the Pacific, right? So like that framing, as Sahel and Ayatollah in causal layered analysis talks about, and actually, if you want to drive transformation and change, going from horizon 1 to horizon 3, because you see there's this big shift happening that needs different regulatory systems or economic models or everything else, because we're going from carbon-based economy to a post-carbon based economy. If you're doing that, you do need to kind of, like, as Sahel says, like intervene at the kind of metaphor and mythology level, which are stories, right? And quite frankly, the right have done that a hell of a lot more effectively than the left have done in terms of connecting to things. So Sahel will talk about, you'll often engage with public service workers about the future of their profession. Analogies that they'll often use are like being on the top of a citadel when there's like archers and marauding hordes all around them trying to take them down. That's often the families and the ministers and the public policy officials and stuff like that. So, but can you reframe the analogies and the metaphors that people are thinking about their situation, their circumstance? And that's a critical way of actually creating the behavior change that you need, rather than just the language change that strategies often remain at, i.e. not actually driving action at all. So that's all very true. However, in my instinct is that the question is who develops the strategy and then gets to tell the story is what's important, and that isn't actually the problem of the narrative or the story. That's actually the problem of power dynamics and access. So I think that those organizations that you mentioned have probably had all sorts of problems with groupthink, greed, inequality, insufficient diversity, and governance problems and lacks of checks and balances. And so that for me is like, who tells the story and whose words are heard to create the narrative, to tell that future vision, is incredibly important. And that's, I think, the work that Betty Sue Flowers, a very close friend of Joe's that I'm pleased to have met, an inspiring person, just talks so passionately about. It's like, how do you tell the underlying mythology or narrative that that is inspiring the, are we talking about the kind of the hero narrative where it's the hero against the world, because that enables and prioritizes all sorts of policy recommendations coming out of it. That's very much, for example, a very Putin way of seeing the world. I'll just finish with one comment as well, which is that, what we're talking about is like, we've got just a huge number of really large institutions, whether they're public or private, multinational companies or WHO or governments, who basically have got 10 to 15 years to stop driving our planet off the cliff, right? And so we're trying to get these massive institutions to change their behaviors radically. I've just come off a panel with OECD, OPSI about missions. And I do wonder whether that whole kind of concept of missions, like the moonshot, but also now the EU has developed 5 new missions around getting cancer treatment by 2030. There's something, a breakthrough cancer treatment. There's something about oceans. There's something about climate change transformation in 250 major cities. So I also think in this kind of world, we need to kind of get that cut through, and we need to say strategy is not the domain of just, about maximizing profitability. It's about maximizing our well-being and, quite frankly, the survival of our species. And so we better all get behind these missions together. And strategy could I think that's why the SDGs are so, Sustainable Development Goals are so fantastic. Whether they go far enough, as David has mentioned, is another question. But I think, as a British person who 6 months before the Brexit referendum actually started the process of getting her Portuguese nationality, because I have a Portuguese mother, I am a believer in hoping for the best, but planning for the worst. And yeah, I think that's what we're doing.
So I'm going to bring you back, since you're talking about the magnitude of change that these organizations are trying to lead and create vision around. Let's talk a little bit about the appetite for transformational change. On the one hand, you have, in essence, initiatives that are demanding significant change in the nature of the institutions and their leadership. You can feel some of the kicking and scratching and clawing. Fear around doing that, or for whatever reason, a lack of will or courage or whatever you would say. And in the midst of this, you do have organizations. DSM is an interesting one, and they've got a long legacy that goes back to prior to their plastics days, right? In terms of organizational transformation. Much sort of more modern one, and just look at the evolution of Netflix, right? From the initial model of mailing CD-ROMs and then turning that into a web streaming service and then adding the content aspect of it now. So they have their own shows, not just showing those of others. So you can imagine, sort of the driving the organizational will and understanding around that change. And I wonder if you could say something more, and Joseph as well, about that sort of appetite for transformation as opposed to transactional or incremental change. From whence does that come? How do you nurture it? How do you nurture leaders who are capable of that vision and then leading the organization forward in initiatives of that magnitude?
Yeah, it's a $1 million question, right? And the answer has to start from working at a very young age, but we don't also have the time. But I do think that in organizations like Teach the Future and different approaches that enable young people to kind of break out of structured thinking, and they're doing it very effectively themselves, quite frankly, already, including how they're engaging with the economy and deciding how to live their lives is really important. But it does also feel as if we need to support the organizational leaders and the ones coming up behind them in this endeavor. I'm very heartened by the fact that it seems as if there has been a new generation of leaders taking over a lot of institutions over the past 2 years. So I mean, that may be me and being over optimistic, but it feels as if, whereas after the last global financial crisis, people were all this, there is no official future, we must build back better. And what they actually did was, cut all investment in long-term thinking and research, and actually was a massive power transfer from the poor to the rich. Actually, this time, and perhaps it is because we've got such a mobilized bunch of under 25-year-olds who really don't have much truck with the system as it is, and don't have much kind of support, there's not much in it for them to support the legacy that they're being given, is there? So, I think that they are more willing to hold our feet to the fire around building back better. And it feels as if the leaders that, there was a whole series of kind of leaders over the 2000s or 2010s that were about kind of incumbency and stability. And then over the past year and a half, I mean, you look at the turnover on a lot of financial institutions, big multinationals, there's something about bringing in leaders for transformation. And then you see, Mark Carney's book on leadership. And, when you're seeing the former Bank of England guy saying, oh, we shouldn't be measuring value by pounds. We need, we need people on the board who are stewards for the future, who are actually doing the right thing for long-term future generations, not just to maximize profits. That's when there seems to be a change. But this stuff does need to be brought through beforehand, right? I'll just give you a nice example from a colleague that we work with very closely called Roger Dennis, who works in New Zealand, to tell you about like how, transformation, or like a lot of these things, as I said, have been kind of happening for like past 10, 20 years. The question is, can we be prepared for them? And he was leading this really interesting piece of strategy work in Canterbury, New Zealand, a health authority, and they were preparing for a future 15 years in the future, right? And it was one in which they were going to have less money, higher need because of the demographics, and also less resources to deliver because there were less people involved at working age. And so they did some really interesting immersive scenarios where they kind of took about 10,000 frontline staff through that experience of actually feeling what that future would look like in 15 years. Now, the interesting kick to this tale is that actually about a year and a half, the earthquake happened, and what they thought they had another 14 years to prepare for actually happened in 5 seconds. And the Canterbury health statistics and in response were fantastically better than other health authorities in terms of their mortality and their morbidity rate, both in the short and the long term. What I'm saying, I guess, is A, it's really important to kind of do stuff beforehand and for it to be institutionalized, but B, our whole conversation about timelines, whether it's 50 years in the future or 2 seconds, is just all it is a device to kind of play around with. As my former boss, Marriott Leslie, in the Foreign Office wrote in a very famous 1987 policy planning paper, we actually think that don't hold on to your seat, guys. We actually think that the Berlin Wall may actually fall in 40 years. So, you're putting the unpalatable on the table, but the timeline doesn't really matter.
Joseph, tell us some of your experiences with transformational change and leadership.
Okay. So thank you for all those stories, Kat. And let me just respond, John, by reaffirming something you said, and then I'll tell you a really interesting story that it's so important to begin doing the work in organizations to nurture the leadership so that they can learn to open up and be more creative and exercise greater foresight. And as Jim mentioned in the opening, that's been my work over 25 years. Is helping organizations to literally go from transactional leadership to transformational leadership. And so here is a story, and I'm going to mention the company's name because it's been public. The story's been publicly told before. We normally wouldn't do that, but this is a company called Enpro Industries, which is it's a mid-size manufacturing firm in North Carolina, but they're global in nature. Their CEO is one of these remarkable people who are really open to growth in both mindset and capacity. They had a division called FME. I think it's Fairbanks Morse Engines, and they made engines that were as large as the room I'm in. They drove the ships, destroyers and big battleships, huge diesel engines. And the problem was they were losing money hand over fist, year after year after year, and they couldn't turn it around. They tried everything. The leadership team, just worked for 5 years trying to turn it around. They couldn't do it. We suggested that they do something different and turn it over to the organization itself, to the people on the shop floor to figure it out. And after a lot of hand wringing, they decided to do that sort of as a last ditch effort, because really they had almost nothing to lose. And so a strategy formation team was formed out of people on the shop floor. These were the people on the shop floor, building these big engines. And it took them 4 or 5 months to work this out, but they created a radical approach to how these engines should be built. And they rearranged the entire methodology. I mean, from top to bottom. And to cut a long story short, after they implemented it and ran it for a year, the build time on these gigantic engines went from 60 weeks to 38 weeks. From 60 weeks to 38 weeks. And it literally made a money-making machine out of FME. And they ran it that way, made a ton of money, and then had an offer they couldn't refuse. Somebody came and bought it. And it was just made them a ton of money. So that's a story that relates to something Kat was talking about, was having the whole community involved, and not just the people at the top.
So we've talked a lot about some of the challenges and obstacles. I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes, second to the last question here. What do you think are the great strengths and opportunities? If you sign on a new client, you're getting to know them and just walking in and introducing yourself to the leadership team. I mean, what do you think are the sort of the the best practices that you're interested in presenting to them. Joseph, you've told us a little bit about some of the methods and that you've developed, but what do you think the greatest possibilities are in terms of formulation of strategy?
Well, yeah, it's an important question. So there's two approaches that I really believe are important. They're not the only two. I'm sure Kat will add to it, but the two approaches I would mention are, first, normative scenario planning, which I've already alluded to, and the second one is called enactment. It's something I'll explain. But going to the first one, normative scenario planning, just to restate briefly, this is turning scenario planning really on its head. The old way was, as I mentioned, enabling the workforce to react to a circumstance much more quickly because they've lived in these scenarios. And at one time that was sufficient, but today in this environment, I personally don't think it's sufficient. I think it's important now to begin having organizations of all stripes, governmental organizations, NGOs, business, to do what we call normative scenario planning, which is creating desired futures for the world, not just for this company or to this organization, but creating desired futures for the world. And instead of just reacting faster to emerging futures. The old way is called adaptive scenario planning. This new way is called normative scenario planning. And as I mentioned, Royal Dutch Shell now, which is facing an existential crisis of its own in the face of climate change, creating a whole new way of doing business, which is green energy as opposed to fossil fuel energy. And they've been embracing these this new way of scenario planning now since they issued blueprints, and they're getting a lot of press for these imaginative new scenarios that they're developing and publishing. So the second way that I think is an opportunity for a new way of implementing and developing strategy is what the cognitive scientists call enactment. Now, this, I'm going to describe it. It sounds so simple that it's almost, a person would dismiss it. But honestly, it's a very effective way for any organization to operate. But in order to do it, they have to go through a transformation like the one we've been talking about, so that the whole community can be involved, the whole system can be involved. So enactment was first described something like 26 years ago by a great cognitive scientist, three of them, led by Francesco Varela, who lived in Paris, but is one of the great strategists and cognitive scientists in his own right. And his colleague Eleanor Roche, who is at Berkeley, and she led the Department of Psychology there for many years. this way of operating is it's more like surfing, where the organization is sensing collectively what they're getting ready to face. If you think of a surfer that is trying to, or a sailor, for example, that is trying to sail a sailboat, if you don't sense in advance where that big wave is coming, it's going to capsize the boat. So these sailors have a way of sensing into it where the boat is heading straight into that wave and cutting through it. And they tack into the future that way. So this is what organizations must learn to do, is in this volatile environment, is to tack into the future this way. It's in effect beating the path as you walk it. And there are ways that using what we call the U process, that the organization can collectively sense what's going on and move to move the ship to meet that wave instead of being, capsized or blindsided by it. And what it means is creating strategy councils. I mean, again, if we have time, we could talk about it, but creating strategy councils that are made up of a diagonal slice of the organization, from the shop floor all the way up to the top. And let's say you have 10 people on that council, and they meet every month for the strategy conversation. And they're going to meet for the better part of a day, and they're going to sense collectively what's going on. And if they don't really understand something, they're going to send 2 or 3 people out on a learning journey to spend 3 days to figure it out. So I'm trying to give you a sense of this is a really radically new way of creating strategy, but it works so beautifully.
I think we need to have a full-blown case history on that at some point. I'd love to learn more. But I'm going to say to Kat, if you could sort of give us your thoughts about sort of what are the best practices as you engage organizational leaders.
Ooh, and I should probably give a caveat here that the kind of work that I've been now doing is more, for example, a big foundation wants to think about what's the future of the human rights field in 20 years' time in 2040, right? How will new technology create new types of human rights violation, but how will it also enable and support, holding people to account, but also how our understanding of of the fact that we're going to need rights legislation for space, but also it seems as if we'll be thinking about rights for not just for an anthropomorphic focused approach for rights, but an ecological bill of rights as well. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that I don't often do the kind of thing where someone's like, help us, we're a big multinational corporation, we want to kind of do our strategy. We tend to kind of work via proxies. They are either governments, local authorities, or foundations who are trying to drive systemic change, whether it's with N Square trying to get to a nuclear weapon-free world by 2045, whether, for example, it's a development organization trying to think about, everybody's going into Mozambique after the cyclones and just busy rebuilding what was there before. What we should be doing is actually doing an appreciative inquiry, and thank you very much for everybody for that discussion there, doing an appreciative inquiry dialogue with younger under 20-year-old Mozambicans as well as over them to say, what does your desired 2030 look like? And let's perhaps consider putting some of that infrastructure rebuilding money into that rather than just rebuilding what was there before. Again, it's one of these really, so that's the kind of thing that we do, as well as, so my 4 things, I was just writing them down as I was listening to Joseph, who's always inspiring as ever. I think the things that are most helpful is when we can come in and safely enable what is already in the organization or in their community to emerge, to Joseph's point. And that tends to be language and structures and framings and devices that enable people with different points of view to be able to safely express them, especially given all the power dynamics that you have in the military, for example, where it's like, you have to have a different point of view. It comes from a 3-star general, which is quite an entertaining instruction to follow. Anyway, so point number 1, giving people the language and the understanding of the fact that there's alternative scenarios, that they are often based on facts, on some facts about the future, although they're different to what we understand as being normal facts about the past. But those facts can be uncertainties, and those uncertainties and building blocks can enable you to have an evidence-based and framed understanding of or engagement with uncertainty. Point number 1. That whole area is really important, and that's what they really get. Second is around network weaving. And there's a whole amazing practice, especially led by Converge. And I know that the guy who set Converge up has just come out with an amazing book that I will put the link there, which is that actually, and they talk about building networks for social transformation. You don't need to like each other, but you don't have to have the same objective or outcome, but you do need to have common purpose, and you do need to have trust. And there are other ways of actually weaving networks. And that's really important, where what you need to do, let's say in transitioning away from post-carbon, you'll have a whole series of early adopters of current actors, a bit like Shell, that know that they're Horizon 1 players, right? They're from the past, but they know that they're going to have to change. And then you need to build those with people who are imagining a much better future. Now, on the other side is a whole series of incumbents who, who cares if the planet burns? Boy, are they going to keep onto their profits and want to maintain the status quo, and they'll try to make that transition as slow as possible. So coalition building is important to bring together the early adopters there, a common purpose. But, and this is the third thing, and this, I'm always surprised, and perhaps this is because I've worked in government, but I'm really surprised how little power analysis is used in the rest of society in terms of understanding incumbency and political changes and how to enable change to happen, and the power of interest groups to kind of advocate for change. So I think there's a whole series of there that I think is really powerful, and I think that's then we also always do a strategic foresight. Well, we try to do a foresight capability audit at the beginning of an intervention, which is like, where are the things in the organization that's already leaning towards the future, that's already pushing for change, that are allies, that, people who are allies, or processes or things that have already been attempted, and where are the things that are blockers? And actually just like, and this is back to the PowerPoint, it's just like pushing a little bit here and pushing a little bit there. That's how sometimes change can powerfully happen in an organization, which is, or in a sector, for example, the peace building sector with women's rights, which has been kind of really stuck for a while, but not because they want to be, but just things have happened. So yeah, you can sometimes unleash things by talking about the future and making things happen. But I wanted to pick up the point about values, which I think was in the chat by someone who is Diane, I think perhaps, which I think is, I think at the end of the day, we are unashamedly talking about values, because back to the very first question that you asked, Jonathan, about what is strategy? I mean, strategy is, when does it not work? It doesn't work when it's not connected to mission. And you cannot have a mission as a breathing organization in 2021 that is not connected to humanity's survival of the next 20 years, not if you kind of like actually can read the science properly, and that isn't connected to human well-being. So I do think that kind of like connection of strategy to values, what's it for? And we, for example, have 3 values at the heart of every single process we design. It's about respecting complexity. It's about putting people at the heart of absolutely everything that we do. And it's putting social justice and purpose and making that explicit, because the other concerning thing is that, conversations about the future, as I said, are about power, and it's about who gets to tell the story of the future. And as more and more organizations are using strategic foresight in particular and stories of the future, I think that power perspective is missing, to the detriment of our community, because sometimes those, and you see it in certain countries around the world, certain organizations in certain countries are using foresight in a way to kind of impose their elite view of the future rather than a participative one.
Thank you. I want to hire you to come into my organization and lead us in these processes. Mr. Garrison, I did have one more question, but I bet you can find a way to weave it into your additional thoughts and whatnot. So if I could invite you back. The only other thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about were some demographic aspects and trends that I think are certainly relevant. We've touched lightly on the generational differences between the boomers and the millennials, and the ascending power, if you will, of the younger generation into the scene. And then I think the other thing would be the focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the strategy formulation process, and what difference that might make as we get a wider variety of voices into the dialogue. I'm sure folks have thoughts about that. Jim, I don't know if you can elegantly weave those into your ideas, but I would just leave it at that and thank Joseph and Kat for, wow, sort of a very, very engaging and challenging view of what strategy can be.
Yes, thank you all. Jonathan, you've moderated an excellent panel here with Kat and Joseph. Thank you all so much. Strategy is a slippery thing, and we think we understand it, and we really don't. And then we think we do again. And I've been sitting here listening to your dialogue, and I wrote something down I'd like to just get your comment on, because I've been thinking about really what is strategy. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about it, Joe, in relationship to your comment right at the beginning around institutional conformity. And Kat, you've been talking about that. Here we have a world in which most people, organizations, I would say even countries, are so engrossed and preoccupied by the present moment, they become susceptible and in fact victimized by circumstances of fate. And I was thinking, well, then what is strategy within the context of institutional conformity, which is sort of the norm if you think about how most of us live our lives and how the world tends to work. And that's why we're gripped by crises that force change. And if we'd have just thought about it a little bit, we could have avoided the crisis. But that doesn't seem to be the way humans have developed over time. So I thought, well, within that context, then what is strategy? And I'd love to put that out there and then have your comments as we close out. I thought strategy is that capacity within the context of institutional conformity that creates a new reality over time through collective and disciplined intention. That strategy is actually the capacity to create a future over time through the persistence of a collective intention. that, as you both said, Kat and Joseph, is adaptive, but it's always creating facts on the ground. It's always with intention, creating reality. And I think that's what I wanted to bring in, that strategy isn't passive or even organizational. It's actually an internal disposition of willingness to be the proximate causation of a possible future over time. Does that make sense? Joe, Kat?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I love your definition there. We ought to write that one down. Jim, the thing that strikes me about what you're saying is that I have said for, a quarter of a century that true leadership, transformational leadership, is the kind of leader who creates new realities. And that's exactly what you're saying. And so this collective leadership within an organization has to be developed. It's a matter of personal development so that they can do this. I know for a fact it can be done. And it's a matter of internal development. We can talk about the tools and the processes that help develop these competencies. And this it's an inner journey that these people have to take.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Kat, any comment?
Yes, I think that's absolutely spot on. And I also wonder what's happening on the kind of shadow Jungian side, or rather Peter Schwartz is kind of like the riptide, right? Things are kind of like, they only come to the surface when they hit the island, having been a wave across the ocean, but you don't see it. And then when that happens, you have like the reverse effect going. And I think that there's also people imagining collective futures that are much more dark, actually. And there's quite, that's been referenced in the chat. And it'll be, it's important that we prevail, I guess. That's probably, this is really, really important discussion. And it's really important that we have it with young people, and bringing in next generation of foresight practitioners together to be part of this is really important too. But thank you, Jim. This has been wonderful. And I've got a little bit of a sense of people's personalities through the chat, which is really lovely as well. And I hope I get to meet you virtually and in person soon.
Yeah, and to your point, Kat, about the shadow content, I mean, we're seeing it here in the United States with the Republican Party. They have a clearly articulated strategy of voter suppression. And because of their persistence, and I would say their discipline, they're creating that reality on the ground. So strategy affects reality, even as reality affects strategy. And it's that dance, both for good and for ill, that creates the future. And so I've loved this discussion. This is really good. We ought to, Jonathan, do this again and go into a deeper dive. And Kat, as I indicated, I'd love to, maybe have you and this institution around the future, because thinking about the future, about how we as humans proactively create it, I think is really important in a time of COVID, when we're all feeling victimized by an external situation that is compressing our capacity to be fully human. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's so much stress in the world. We don't know how to get out of this box. But strategic thinking particularly, Joseph, in the way you articulate it as transformational and proactive and unifying, is a badly needed, I think, ingredient in our collective capacity in the midst of just COVID to create a meaningful future orientation. So this has been a very deep dialogue, and I just want to acknowledge that. And Jonathan, again, thank you for your willingness to put this together, and let's see what we might be able to do down the road.
I would love that, and again, appreciate the opportunity to take advantage of the platform. It's been a gift to spend time, meet Kat, and spend more time with Joseph and you as well. So thank you so much. I'd be happy to do more.
Perfect. Thank you all. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jim.
Yes, Joe?
Thank you. I was just saying thank you, and really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Jonathan, do you want to make any final word?
Sorry, can I also just say thank you very much, Jonathan. And I reached out to Lawrence Freedman and I asked him your question, which was, what do you think, Sir Lawrence, Sir Freedman? I can never get my... what should the first chapter of your second volume be? And he actually has 4 answers here for you. So I will send this to you, and we should meet up and have tea with him shortly and discuss this second volume.
Brilliant.
Okay, Jim, we're teed up for next time.
Great. Okay. Thank you all. We'll see you all again here tomorrow. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about the theme of longevity. There's a lot of breakthrough research indicating that human beings could be living much longer than we currently are if we understand ourselves in a more dimensionalized and deeply rooted way. So that'll be tomorrow on Humanity Rising. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.